Thank you so much, Professor Hill and Professor Robertson von Trotha for the wonderful introduction and warm welcome. And I would also like to use this opportunity to acknowledge the various institutions and people whose contribution and effort is the reason why I am here today. So I'm particularly grateful to the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation, whose Philip Schwartz Initiative grant, assisted me in coming. And I'm also really grateful to the Global South Studies Center at the University of Cologne, which is my host institution. And all these institutions and the people gathered here today, what they hold in common is that they contribute something to scholarship. And generally, when you contribute something to scholarship in whatever form, I think it is a blessing to all academics and to humanity in general. And for that, I am really grateful to the Karlsruhe Institute of Technology for providing such a conducive environment where people like me can come and share their ideas with colleagues and students and the general public. And so the discussion today is going to be structured in this form. So there are basically 4 sections. And so from the topic, as we saw earlier, I'm looking at human trafficking in the context of migration, and that is from Cameroon to the Gulf Arab states, so specifically to countries like Oman, the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and Kuwait. And one of the most important things about human trafficking, even though I focus in this particular setting, I think as Professor Robertson von Trotha said earlier, human trafficking is a problem which affects every society all over the world. So you're either affected as a source, a transit, or destination, but in so many instances, societies are affected by a combination of all these. So like Cameroon and the countries which I'm looking at, they are known for being a source, a transit, and destination countries for human trafficking. But in the context of this study, as I mentioned earlier, and I would like to emphasize, my focus is on a specific type of human trafficking, and that is the one which involves movement from Cameroon to countries in the Gulf Arab state. And my discussion today would center on the experiences of many young women, from Cameroon, whose experiences are very common to the one of the lady at the center of this photo. Her name is our Francisca Mboli. She's one of several women whom I interviewed for my study. And what is very interesting about her story is that at some point in her life, she went through this really horrible experience. She was lured into migration, to the Gulf state with promises of a really good job, good income, greener pasture. And she's a mother of 2 with a master's degree. So in 2015, after completing her education and with a young baby, she needed to move to the next stage in life, which was to build a career. And the opportunity presented itself to her to travel to the Gulf state and work as a school teacher. But little did she know that that was just a cover story. So she found herself later on in Kuwait in a situation, in the worst nightmare that she could ever imagine. And through a combination of forces and a series of events, she one day, saw a way out. And this happened again in the most unlikely way. She was watching a CNN program. There is a program on CNN called the CNN Freedom Project, and they talk about cases of human trafficking and so-called modern-day slavery all over the world. And in this program, there was a hotline. So Francisca took down the number, called the number eventually when she had the opportunity, and on the other side of the line, she got into contact with this really amazing organization, Freedom for All. Yeah. And the CEO of Freedom for All, Katie Ford, pulled together her resources, mobilized her network, and was able to get in contact with local advocacy groups in Kuwait and Cameroon. And also, she got in contact with people who are in position of power, who could really make a difference. And that is how Francisca was rescued from this horrible ordeal. But then when she came to Cameroon, it did not stop there. Yeah, she continued to partner with Katie Ford, and she even formed her own organization known as a Survivors Network. And through this collaboration and grassroots effort, they were able to rescue close to 30 other women from Kuwait who were in similar situations like her. And on this photo, she was being awarded, she was recognized in the State Department and was named a Trafficking in Person Report Hero in 2018. So her story is one of, I just see it as movement from victimhood to a savior. But this is a very unique story. It is also very similar to the stories of so many women. Similar in the sense that it's more or less the same process that gets them into this situation of servitude or bondage. But then it is different in the sense that she decided to chart a path for herself after she was rescued. She became an advocate, she spoke out, and I mean, if you go online, you just Google the name Our Francisca, you will come across several interviews and documentaries which she's involved in. Yeah. But then there are other women who maybe have a completely different situation. Yeah. After trafficking or after rescue, they are very traumatized. So there are so many people who don't talk about it. They stay quietly and try to deal with it in their own way. Yeah. And when we talk about human trafficking, basically it's a concept which is very broad and sometimes is conflated. Yeah. And so most of the studies out there, especially the reports you get from some of the big international organizations which are doing a lot of hard work to document this unfortunate situation. They work with concepts like modern-day slavery, forced labor, forced migration, and so the very concept of human trafficking, in order to at least be on the same page in our conversation, I would like to at least explain what it is. So the definition out there which is widely used is the one which comes from the Palermo Protocol in 2000. So this convention defines human trafficking in terms that identifies three basic aspects. So first, there is an act, which is the act of recruiting, then transportation and movement. Then there is the means of, committing this act, and that is done usually through force. It is done usually through threats. And finally, there is a purpose. The purpose basically is exploitation. Yeah. And most countries like Cameroon, they have their own definition of human trafficking, but then it draws directly from this Polemo protocol, which is understandable because the very reason for this UN definition of human trafficking was to assist various nations to come up with legislation, legislations which could be used at least in court to, try people and punish them for engaging in this horrible act. Yeah. So in Cameroon, human trafficking basically is conceptualized or understood, as a form of forced kidnap. Yeah, forced kidnap and generally movement within or outside the country with the aim of exploiting that individual or group of individuals. Yeah. But then the UN, this definition of human trafficking, as good as it is, when it comes to policy, when it comes to practical issues like persecuting people, it has a role. But then in academic work, it is a bit problematic. And so it has been criticized by scholars for making a distinction between trafficking and smuggling. Yeah. And the critique generally is that it ignores the often restricted conditions under which people are smuggled. Yeah. So when it comes now to analytical work, the concept itself, we really struggle with it. Like, when do you draw the line between smuggling and trafficking? When we know so well that, from our data, sometimes these practices are interconnected in ways that it is really not easy to make such differentiation. Yeah. And how did I get to the topic of human trafficking? Yeah. My interest in this topic came about quite recently, and it came about around the same time when it was an issue, it became an issue of public debate in Cameroon. So just like Francisca, so many young women and men, of course, they were lured into migration with promises of good jobs, greener pasture, by posters, flyers, like the one you see there. You find these flyers online, but more so in Cameroon, you could find them, on public buildings and public spaces. They would just paste them around, advertising all these jobs in the Gulf state. And most people seeing this opportunity, especially in the context of high unemployment and difficulties, with a really large youthful population which is unemployed, of course they're drawn to it. But then, as soon as they arrive in the Gulf state, the reality becomes different. So the picture to the right, is a labor recruitment agency in Kuwait. And basically, the way trafficking works, it is connected to the migration regime in the Gulf state. Just to briefly simplify that, migration to the Gulf Arab state is they have one of the most progressive immigration policies. Going there is very easy. And when you look at the context of migration from Cameroon or Africa to these countries, it is happening at a time when traditional migration destinations are becoming increasingly difficult. So what the Gulf offers is really like an easy means, to migrate. But on the flip side, the very regime of migration that gives us this very progressive migration possibility has really no other way or no plan for dealing with this immigrant in a humane way. So the process, the regulation of immigrant is relegated to citizens and employers. So basically, all it takes to bring someone as a migrant worker in this state is for an individual, a citizen, or a company to sign a piece of paper that I will employ this person, and that is it. But then they have the responsibility to make sure that whoever is under them, that is migrant worker, lives, respect the laws and regulation of the state, and returns back after their work contract has ended. Yeah. And the way citizens and employers are able to fulfill this function, this responsibility, because failure for compliance with the law by any immigrant, the people held responsible are the citizens or the employers. So what they do generally is, as soon as you step in, they take your passport. It is illegal in these countries to do that, but nevertheless, it is widely practiced. Because so many migrants from those labor recruiting agencies, they end up in homes where they work as domestic servants for very long hours, and they get abused physically, mentally, and so forth. So the first response for most migrants is they want to go back. As soon as they realize that they are not getting the teaching job, they are not getting the nursing job or banking jobs, they want to go back because they did not sign up for domestic work. Yeah. But then they can't go back until they pay for the amount which was invested, to bring them to Kuwait. So eventually, those who managed to return to Cameroon in early 2015, so there was these testimonials, on national radio, community radio, it was all over social media, and as soon as the general public became aware of what was happening, there was general outrage. Yeah. And as you can see, one of the main reactions was a protest. Yeah, so you had people mobilizing and protesting. There was act of vandalism against those migration brokers, their workplaces, all posters that advertise migration and work opportunities in the Gulf state were torn apart. And seeing what was going on, the state stepped in, and just followed where the wind was blowing. And several of those job recruitment or migration brokers were arrested, their offices were shut down, and it is in that context that the issue of human trafficking became a hot issue of debate in Cameroon. But of course, before that, there have been some work going on, but that was mostly focused on human trafficking within the country, which is another issue. And like I said, it's something which I am not going to discuss yet. And one other point which I like to make, for those who perhaps are familiar with the literature on migration to the Gulf state, of course, there are so many things going on. Yeah. So this is not, human trafficking is one of those things. In a recent publication which I co-authored with a colleague, we looked at the economic diversification of African migrants in Dubai. And specifically, we look at how they are able to move, up the economic ladder. Yeah. So there are opportunities in the Gulf state, but then there are also serious issues, and that is what this lecture is really focusing about. I just like to bring that up because in the past I have had situations where maybe it might sound as if, oh, but you're talking about all this gloom, gloom, gloom. Why are people going there? Yeah, because there are also opportunities. Yeah. And one of the most difficult things in the studies on human trafficking is like numbers. Yeah. So the numbers is very hard to get figures. So earlier on we heard already that there are 40 million of people who are in modern day slavery. And that number, if you break that number further, you realize that about 70% of them are women, then 30% of them are men. And a good chunk of them are in forced marriages, and the rest are in forced labor conditions. Yeah. But then what these general statistics tell us is like, it draws attention to the prevalence of the problem. Yeah. But then, if you go beyond that, the U.S. State Department is very invested in the fight against human trafficking. And so they have this, their own numbers, which is also it goes a bit more, it goes further than just identifying general numbers, So they have this ranking system where they rank countries around the world, on different scales. And those countries which are doing almost nothing, where human trafficking is really thriving, they are ranked at the bottom, tier 3. Yeah. Then those which are doing slightly better, they are on tier 2 watch list. And then tier 2 are those which are really like doing a lot, but still there is room for more to be done. Then there is tier 1. You have those countries where, of course, they do have problems of human trafficking, but they're doing just what, according to the criteria which is used for this ranking, is enough. It meets the basic minimum standard. Yeah. And if we look further, still from this U.S. State Department ranking, just taking 2 countries, and here Cameroon and Kuwait. So there is also longitudinal data which shows, how good or bad the country has been doing in terms of combating human trafficking over a period of time from 2011 to 2018. So what you notice here is that people are leaving Cameroon, a country where, of course, there is room for more to be done, but as far as combating human trafficking is concerned, some fairly good work is taking place or has been done. So they're leaving Cameroon to Kuwait, for example, which, as you can see, from 2011 to 2015. So Kuwait basically was like doing almost nothing. Yeah. So Kuwait is one of those countries where the conditions for human trafficking are really, ripe. Yeah. But then from 2016 onward, there was a slight improvement, but not as good because it is still on the tier 2 watch list. Yeah. So what are my research objectives? So the objectives, I have 2. The first one is to gain a better understanding of the gender dimensions and dynamics of human trafficking. And the second one, to look at the roles of different actors in the trafficking and anti-trafficking campaign. And I use various tools to, address this problem, to analyze this problem. So the conceptual tool draws from the work of Aisha Chala and Nina Glickschiller. They published this really fantastic book in 2018. And the 2 main concepts from their work because they look at there are so many things which they are discussing. Yeah. But the multiscalar analysis is one which I find really useful in my work. Yeah. So as indicated in the quote, yeah, Aisha Chala and Nina Glitschiller make the point that small social change in a particular location often connect to wider processes of social, economic, and political transformation. Yeah. And in analysis that takes into consideration this kind of connections, interconnection between the local and the global, what is important, they argue, is to focus on the interconnections in institutionalized and informal networks, which hold different amount of power, of course. Even though people are connected to different networks, we know that there are other variables because the kind of network that you are connected to and what you are able to achieve or do also depend on your power position in society. So it becomes very important for people to have network which goes both vertical and horizontal. Yeah. But then the second point which is really important in their analysis is temporality, and they capture that with the concept of historical conjuncture. Yeah. And basically, they argue that it is important to conceptualize time in relation to changing configurations of intersecting multiscalar network of disparate power. Yeah. So basically, what is going on in the local, of course, it's important to look at it in a particular context, but then that context itself is being influenced, by forces beyond the local. Yeah. And these interconnections are really, really vital in analysis that, are using this approach. But then how does this relate to my work? Yeah. So specifically, I can give one example. Yeah. So looking at even small changes that are taking place in Cameroon, those changes, of course, are affected by global forces. And a very typical example which comes to mind is you take the role. Already earlier I pointed to the Trafficking in Person report, which is produced by the US State Department. And of course, there are so many other things which the State Department and the US government has done, yeah, which is also influencing not just the discourse, but how we as a society approach human trafficking. But then, because of the dominant role of the United States, very minor policy changes in the US have immediate consequences. Like a few days ago, the White House released its idea of a budget for the 2021 fiscal year. And what was very conspicuous about that budget was like cuts, serious cuts, not just to social programs in the United States, but also to foreign aid. Yeah. Basically, what this means is that there is less funding for some of those programs, those initiatives which are at the forefront in the fight against human trafficking. And we also see this in the policy. The US government, you can look at it in any way. With the new administration, what is well known about their policy has been a withdrawal from the world stage. Yeah. And what that withdrawal means, we don't really know. I mean, one can only speculate. But what is certain is that it produces consequences which affect societies and communities far away from the United States. Yeah. And you can also make the same argument or the same point with respect to the work of organizations like the International Labour Organization, International Organization for Migration. Their work also depends on funding, yeah. And all these things, whether with funding or with more funding or less funding, of course, they are directly affecting the kind of policies, you know, and the kind of possibilities which are created in small communities and societies all over the world. Yeah. Then, in terms of research method, the study draws from ethnographic research which was conducted in 2015 in the United Arab Emirates, and also from ethnographic research which was conducted in 2016 in Cameroon. And the study is a collaboration with Michaela Pelikan. You know, she works on transnational migration and interconnections between Africa and Asia, specifically the Gulf Arab state and China. So in the context of this project, I did 50 interviews in Cameroon and 35 interviews in the Gulf state, in Dubai specifically. Yeah. And we looked at different issues, you know, various networks and networks of both anti-trafficking organizations and also trafficking networks, and of course collection of documents. And from the picture, you can see, as a typical ethnographer, this is a photo of one of the women who was trafficked to Kuwait. Then when she returned to Cameroon, she has a business. So this is her in front of her business, and she's very grateful that she did not sell the business before migrating to Cameroon, to Kuwait, something which her trafficker convinced her to do. But thanks to her younger sister, she resisted that temptation. Then to the right is a picture of one of those job recruitment agencies in Kuwait, and she took that picture. She documented her experiences in the Gulf state, and the information, you know, much of the information which I have, because I have never been to Kuwait, yeah, and I really don't know what the labor recruitment agencies there are like, but thanks to this kind of documentation from some of the survivors, at least those are the documents and informations which are being used, you know, in my analysis. And the various key actors, of course, there is the media, NGOs, local and international, and then international organizations and so forth. Yeah. Then, of course, the research findings. The main research findings, you know, is there is what I call the ambivalence and network ties of human trafficking brokers. So generally, we find that the network of people involved in trafficking is a very loose one. Yeah. And this is really interesting to me because when you look at the literature, human trafficking is generally described in so many studies as some form of organized criminal network, which I believe is the case in some cases. But then studies like this, you know, you indicate that, of course, there are variations. Yeah. Because the people who are involved in this network, usually they come from just almost every background. They are extended family members, they are intermediaries, and the issue of intermediaries in the Cameroon context is extremely important. I would explain that later. Yeah. Then, of course, there are local travel agents and employers in the Gulf state like the one, or employment agencies in the Gulf state like the ones we saw earlier. Yeah. And these processes, trafficking, is embedded in just everyday practices which are normalized or unproblematic in Cameroon. And yet, the issue of intermediaries in Cameroon generally, the way people, the difficulties of dealing with, bureaucratic procedures which are really dense in Cameroon is very cumbersome. And so many people would rather just look for an intermediary and then pay them some extra money, to deal with all those things on their behalf. So we have these kind of things. Even people who are experts, who are bureaucrats themselves, when it is their turn to deal with, the same institutions, sometimes they just find it really challenging and time-consuming. So you have intermediaries. Yeah. So there is always, and the closer you are to a person, the more authentic and trustworthy you are. So because sometimes, like I said, the issue of time, so instead of standing in line for hours or days to do something, of course, you just look for a very familiar face around, whom you can trust and who has the time and also, of course, the knowledge to go through that bureaucratic procedure. And you pay that person, you give them some extra money. So this kind of reliance on intermediaries works in a way that the people you first rely on are the ones who are familiar to you. And even when they are unable to do something, they might know someone. But then if someone who is familiar to you recommends another person, of course, you are more likely to go with that person. And what they do is, even recommending some person, you get a little commission from that. So this is the kind of society where we operate in Cameroon. And in the context of migration, especially dealing with the migration regulatory regimes, which is even a more complex bureaucracy, there is a need for intermediaries. So people are not just going around and working extremely hard to convince people, to migrate or to trust them to at least compile the necessary documents on their behalf. Yeah. But instead, there is a demand for such services. Yeah. And unfortunately, because of the loose connections between the network of actors who are involved, you find a close face, a family member who might be promoting or encouraging you to, work with a particular broker. And they are doing so because they have a little commission, but with very little knowledge of the outcome of their action, the consequence of their action on the person who is being, encouraged to travel. Yeah. So the point is, this loose network of actors, you find people who are positioned differently and their different position means they have different knowledge and understanding of what is going on. Yeah. Then the second main finding is the role of gender, in the fight against human trafficking. So you see, there are various actors who are involved. On the broader level, the international level, you have those institutions like the State Department, diplomatic missions, especially the American Embassy, of course, which is under the State Department. The British Embassy is also one of them, the International Labour Organization, and the IOM. Yeah, they are all really active. And in Cameroon, they work very closely with the state. And the state institution, which is really at the forefront of fighting against human trafficking, is the Interministerial Committee. This Interministerial Committee is on the national level, but then at the regional level, they are represented in 3 main regions in Cameroon, which are considered to be those regions where human trafficking is really high. Yeah. So at the regional level, they are represented by what they call the Governor's Task Force. Yeah. Because we have like governors who are the regional administrative head leaders. Yeah. And this regional Governor's Task Force, they are comprised usually of quite a number of actors. Of course, the most senior administrator, who is the governor. Then you have judges, the police, and really people in government who are really vital in any fight against human trafficking. But then they work very closely with civil society actors, NGOs, the media. So that is what the Interministerial Committee at the regional level comprises of. But then the Interministerial Committee they don't work directly with survivors. They don't work directly with people. They are supposed to, but they don't have the resources or the expertise. Yeah. So they now rely more on organizations, NGOs, which are on the ground and working closely with survivors and also sensitizing the public. And you would find that some of these NGOs, they are representatives or members, they are also part of the task force, yeah, but they are very independent from the task force. And the international community or the international organizations, while they work with the government in terms of the very creation of interministerial committee, is an initiative which was pushed forward by vital voices and the U.S. State Department. You know, they really push for this kind of a special task force to really address the urgency of the problem. So the creation of the government unit itself is thanks to this international organization. But then the international organization, while working with the state, they also work directly with those actors on the ground, you know, NGOs. And the 2 main NGOs, which are really well known and are very active, I mean, there are others. They are both, the first one, Kumufetfed, is a women's organization. The second one, Justice and Peace Service, is I don't know, it's an affiliate of the Catholic Church, yeah, but it's headed by, you know, some really powerful women, yeah. And then you have Survivors Network, and this is the network which was formed by our Francisca, the lady we saw earlier, the one who was rescued, yeah. So these are some of the main grassroots organizations which are at the forefront of human trafficking. And you can see that they work with the state, but then they also work directly with international organizations. Yeah. And you can see that from the picture. So the first picture, you see this is a workshop organized by human trafficking survivors, and it's basically a workshop which was organized by the Survivors Network. So in the middle of it, you find is Katie Ford, the CEO of Freedom for All. And then there is also the lady in the green t-shirt, that is Francisca Awa, the one who was rescued in Kuwait. Yeah. So you see this kind of network, and in this case, it's a female organization in Cameroon, which is working directly with a leading philanthropist in the fight against human trafficking, who is a woman. And the picture below is that of one of the other organizations which I identified earlier, Kumufetfe, and this is in the context of the Governor's Task Force. So you can see them, they're out there doing a campaign, sensitization campaign, and they are pasting flyers on buses, with the sign, "No to human trafficking." Yeah. And so at least in conclusion, what we can say is that first, as far with respect to the issue of ambivalence of human trafficking and the loose nature of network ties between brokers, it poses a special challenge. Yeah. And the challenge is that human trafficking, when you are dealing with a well-organized institution, you are dealing with a well-connected network as in organized crime. I mean, it is easy to know what you're against, and you can dismantle such a network. If you identify it and you dismantle it, then you are really close to at least resolving the problem. But the case here is that they are very loose and connected often thanks to the advanced nature of communication today. This is another transformation in society, because I only imagine what it would have looked like 20 years ago, without the availabilities of cheap cell phones and internet. Yeah, it might have affected the way these networks are structured, and of course their ability to traffic people. That is something which is just a speculation, but what is certain is that the modern way of communication is really playing a key role in keeping this network loose, and by staying loose, of course, it becomes difficult to dismantle something which is not even well organized. Yeah. And interestingly, the network of traffickers is very different from the network of anti-traffickers, because the network of women and female organizations that are at the forefront of human trafficking, we see that they are well organized. Yeah. They are really, you see these connections between different actors. They work together, they meet constantly, they have an agenda. But then what is also very important, because of course we might wonder, why then do we have this problem still, so alarming, despite the assertion that they are well organized? Yeah, these are organizations, the organizations that are taking the lead. These are non-governmental grassroots organizations. So it probably would be a different story if this kind of networking and organization was between states, say Cameroon and Kuwait and the United States, and that would probably produce a different outcome. Yeah, but it is not like that, and there are so many reasons why it is not like that. Yeah. And then going down to women playing a leading role in fighting human trafficking. What is very important to know is that their action is taking place within a context of global regime of anti-human trafficking established in the 2000s, first by the Palermo Protocol and also by the Trafficking in Person legislation, which was passed by the United States, U.S. Trafficking Victim Protection Act. It was passed in 2000. Yeah. So these different organizations and legislation, of course, they help in making the issue of human trafficking something which is worth fighting for. And they also mobilize resources which are available, to those who are interested in fighting against this ill. So even though women at the grassroots are mobilizing, are at the forefront of the fight against human trafficking, they are doing so because there is the global powers and dynamics at the time have created the opportunity for this kind of grassroots action to take place. And the reason I bring this still is to go back to Aisha Chalas and Nina Glick-Schiller's concept of multiscalar analysis and historical conjuncture. Because what is happening on the ground, you need to always have an eye on what is going on around the globe. You need to always have an eye on the global constellations of power which are constantly changing. Because like I explained earlier, if there are new dynamics in play leading to the withdrawal of funding for human trafficking initiative, it will directly affect some of these grassroots efforts. And with that, thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much for coming.